What you're watching right now is not a regional conflict. It is the live stress test of the entire post-World War II global order, and America is right in the middle of it, whether most people here want to acknowledge that or not. China has spent years quietly reshaping Iran's entire electronic warfare landscape, exporting advanced radar systems, transitioning Iranian military navigation away from American GPS and onto China's own encrypted Beidou 3 satellite constellation, and drawing on its expanding satellite network to support signals, intelligence, and terrain mapping for Iranian forces. That is not trade. That is not diplomacy. That is one superpower methodically preparing another nation's military for a confrontation it knew was coming. Meanwhile, Russia has been sharing imagery from its sophisticated network of overhead satellites directly with Iran, giving Tehran eyes it never had on its own. US officials noted that several recent Iranian strikes hit facilities directly associated with American operations, targets whose coordinates do not appear on any public map. Think carefully about what that means. Someone told them where to look. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Moscow has bought more than $4 billion worth of weapon systems from Tehran, mostly Shahed kamikaze drones. Now that debt is being repaid, not in money, but in battlefield intelligence. This is not merely a regional strike. It is a potentially disruptive event for the entire emerging multipolar commercial architecture of Eurasia. What is being built right now in real time is an alternative world order, one designed specifically to operate outside of American reach. And the question every American should be asking is this: when did we stop paying attention? Now, let's be absolutely clear about what we are really witnessing right now in this moment of history, because if you strip away the headlines and the noise and the breaking news chyrons cycling across your screen, what you are left with is something far more consequential than most Americans are being told. This is not just a war between Israel and Iran. This is not just another flare-up in an unstable region that Americans have grown tired of caring about. What is happening right now, in real time, as you watch this video, is the live unraveling of the American-led world order that has governed global affairs since 1945. And the people who built the alternative to that order, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, have been quietly laying the foundation for this moment for years. Let's go back to where the groundwork was being laid, because that is how you understand what is happening today. Iran hosted militaries from China, India, Russia, and 6 other countries for the first ever Shanghai Cooperation Organization military exercise on Iranian soil. Think about what that means. That exercise, called Sahand 2025, was not merely a counter-terrorism drill. It sent a clear geopolitical signal of Tehran's full integration into the multilateral partnership led by China and Russia, illustrating how Beijing and Moscow now see Iran as a valuable participant in their broader regional projects. You have to understand, for the longest time, China was cautious about being too publicly associated with Iran, too much risk, too much exposure. But that calculation changed. The exercise was a public declaration. China is no longer afraid to be seen standing next to Tehran on the world stage, and that shift has enormous implications for American foreign policy, for the Middle East, and yes, for your daily life here in the United States. In late 2025 and early 2026, Iran intensified its Look East policy, finalizing a 20-year comprehensive strategic partnership treaty with Russia and accelerating the 25-year cooperation program with China. Let me say that again. A 20-year treaty with Russia and a 25-year cooperation program with China. These are not short-term tactical deals. These are generational commitments. These are 2 of the world's largest economies and military powers saying to Iran, we are with you for the long haul. And while Washington was focused on negotiations, on ultimatums, on trying to pressure Tehran through sanctions that China was helping to evade, Beijing and Moscow were drafting strategic blueprints that would outlast any single American administration. Now, here is where the technology piece becomes critical because people tend to think of war in terms of bombs and missiles and soldiers on the ground. But the wars of the 21st century are also fought with satellites, with electronic warfare, with the ability to see what your enemy is doing before they move. Russia provided intelligence support to Iran, including data on US military positions, while China focused on diplomatic mediation and limited material assistance, such as spare parts for missiles. US officials reported that Moscow supplied Iran with real-time data on American warships and aircraft, enabling more precise retaliatory strikes. This assistance included satellite feeds from Russian assets, which helped Iran monitor US forces. So when Iranian missiles were hitting targets associated with American operations, they were hitting them with coordinates that came from Russian intelligence. That is not a proxy relationship anymore. That is a direct operational partnership. And China's contribution was no less sophisticated. China is providing Iran with satellite intelligence, including detailed images of the US military buildup in the region. And then there was the Starlink operation. With Chinese and Russian help, Iran identified and rolled up Israel's Iranian network, including claims that it killed Mossad's main organizer in Iran, making it a costly venture for Israeli intelligence. Israel and the United States were using Elon Musk's Starlink system to communicate with intelligence assets inside Iran. And then, with Chinese technical assistance, Iran blocked it, shut it down, left an entire covert network without communications. That is not the military capability of a nation that has been cornered and isolated. That is the military capability of a nation that has been quietly equipped by two superpowers who want it to survive and remain in play. In February 2025, Beijing sold Iran 1,000 tons of sodium perchlorate, a solid rocket fuel component. This transfer was sufficient to power between 200 and 300 Hajj Qasem and Khaybar Sheikhan missiles, which Tehran had previously used to hit Israel. The US Treasury Department responded by designating 6 Chinese companies and 6 Chinese citizens for their roles in providing the IRGC with propellant ingredients for its missiles. 6 companies, 6 citizens designated. And yet the cooperation continued. It did not stop. It did not slow down. Because here is what you need to understand about how Beijing approaches these relationships. China does not respond to American pressure by retreating. China responds by adapting, by routing around the obstacle, by finding the next channel through which it can deliver what its partners need. And the propellant deal tells you everything about where China's priorities sit when it comes to the Iranian military program. Following the 12-day war with Israel in June 2025, the Iranian government accelerated negotiations with Russia and China to procure advanced missile systems. Iran lost significant portions of its missile stockpile in that conflict. Israel had targeted missile production sites, transport systems, launch infrastructure. Iran came out of that war militarily degraded but politically defiant. And the first thing it did was turn east. It turned to Beijing, it turned to Moscow. Independent experts suggested that it could take at least a year to reach the level of military capability prior to the 12-day war. And to do so, Iran would need external support. China's military-industrial complex was positioned to meet those needs in ways that Russia, still drained by the Ukraine war, simply could not. And so we got what we are seeing today, a rearmed, reconstituted Iran, backed by Chinese components and Russian intelligence, facing down the combined military power of the United States and Israel. Now let's talk about what actually happened on February 28, 2026. Because this is the moment that changed everything. The wave of airstrikes began after sunrise in Iran, with huge explosions ringing out in the capital Tehran. Videos showed large plumes of thick smoke. Israel and the United States began a series of strikes against Iran, aimed at inducing regime change and targeting its nuclear and ballistic missile program. And then came the confirmation that redrew the entire map of Middle Eastern geopolitics. On February 28, 2026, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, was assassinated in Tehran as part of a series of Israeli airstrikes aimed at high-ranking Iranian officials. 86 years old, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for over 3 decades, gone, killed in daylight by Israeli jets dropping bombs on his compound as part of a joint operation coordinated fully between Washington and Tel Aviv. The joint US and Israeli attack assassinated Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader, whose compound was destroyed. Other Iranian officials were also killed. Iran then launched hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles at targets in Israel and at US military bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates. The retaliation was not symbolic. It was not the restrained, pre-warned response Iran had offered in previous exchanges. This was a full-scale, multi-directional strike campaign. Iran hit US bases across the entire Gulf region. It hit Israeli territory. It hit allied states that it accused of facilitating the attacks. The United States Embassy in Kuwait was also hit by an Iranian missile strike, prompting Secretary of State Rubio to close the embassy until further notice. An American embassy struck in Kuwait. That is the level of escalation we are dealing with right now. And the Strait of Hormuz, this is where the conflict stopped being a military story and became an economic story that touches every single American. The Strait of Hormuz experienced ongoing geopolitical and economic disruption following the joint military strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran. In response, Iran launched retaliatory missile and drone attacks, while its IRGC issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the strait, leading to an effective halt in shipping traffic. Tanker traffic dropped first by 70%, then ground to near zero. This disruption affected approximately 20% of the world's daily oil supply and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas, prompting major shipping concerns across global markets. 20% of the world's oil halted, not reduced, not rerouted, halted. Iran's IRGC declared that it would not allow even 1 liter of oil to pass through the Strait of Hormuz for the benefit of the US and its allies. And then Iran's spokesperson went further. You will not be able to artificially lower the price of oil, the statement read. Expect oil at $200 per barrel. Now you might hear that and think it sounds like bluster, but let's look at where prices actually went. Oil prices have gyrated wildly since the United States and Israel launched joint airstrikes on Iran on February 28th. Disruptions to Middle Eastern supplies due to attacks on the region's oil infrastructure and the cessation of tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz sent Brent futures soaring, trading within reach of $120 per barrel. Oil prices topped $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. A sustained increase in energy costs could trigger a surge in inflation and squeeze economic growth, raising fears of stagflation. That word should mean something to every American who remembers the 1970s or who has studied what it does to ordinary working families. You get rising prices at the same time as slowing economic growth. Your wages are not keeping up, but everything you buy is getting more expensive. Gasoline, groceries, utilities, everything that runs on energy runs on oil. And when oil goes past $100 a barrel and heads toward $120, that shock spreads through the entire economy like a current through water. Goldman economists raised their odds of a recession this year by 5 percentage points to 25%. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario in which global oil prices average $140 a barrel for 2 months, what they characterize as a breaking point for the world economy, enough to push the Eurozone, the UK, and Japan into economic contraction and create an economic standstill in the United States. An economic standstill in the United States. Not in some far off country that Americans can feel distant from. Here, in the country that ordinary working Americans wake up in every morning, go to work in, pay their rent in, raise their children in. This is not an abstraction. This is the direct cost of a geopolitical strategy that failed to account for the depth of the China-Russia-Iran alignment that had been building for years, right in plain sight. About 89% of the oil that flows through the Strait of Hormuz is bound for Asian markets, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea the top buyers. And this is where China's position becomes extraordinarily complex and revealing. Beijing has the most to lose in the short term from a closed strait. China is the world's largest crude oil importer and purchases more than 80% of Iranian oil. Around 40% of its total oil imports pass through Hormuz. And yet China has continued providing material and intelligence support to the nation that is closing that same strait. Why? Because Beijing is playing a longer game than any single disruption. China is willing to absorb short-term economic pain to position itself as the dominant power in the post-conflict regional order. China wants to be the country that rebuilds Iran. China wants to be the country that the Gulf states turn to when they conclude, as they increasingly are concluding, that American security guarantees are not what they used to be. While Gulf states have begun to question the effectiveness of American security guarantees, especially after the events of 2025 and 2026, they have turned to China as an alternative arms supplier and close economic partner. Think about that. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. These are countries that have been anchored to the American security umbrella for decades. And right now, in the middle of this war, they are being struck by Iranian missiles, and they are simultaneously questioning whether Washington actually protects them or whether Washington uses them. That is a seismic shift in alliance politics, and it is happening right now, not in some theoretical future. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi called Russia and China Iran's strategic partners and confirmed his country was receiving military cooperation from the two US adversaries. He said it openly on American television to an American audience. That includes military cooperation, he confirmed. He did not feel the need to hide it anymore. That is a measure of how much the strategic balance has shifted. When a foreign minister of a nation at war with the United States can go on camera and tell an American news network calmly and without apology that his country is receiving military support from both Russia and China and nothing structurally changes, it tells you something profound about the limits of American leverage in this new world. Araghchi vowed that Iran will attack oil facilities across the Persian Gulf if the US targets Iran's oil infrastructure. He said Iran would attack any energy infrastructure in the region that belongs to an American company or in which an American company holds a share. Now, think about what that means for global markets. Think about what it means for your pension fund, your 401k, the investments of ordinary middle class Americans if the Gulf's energy infrastructure becomes a battleground. Qatar's energy minister warned that Gulf states would likely shut down production in light of Iranian strikes that damaged Qatar's largest natural gas plant and the ongoing Iranian targeting of oil tankers traveling through the region. Qatar, which provides 12 to 14% of Europe's LNG, was hit. Its production was halted. Europe, already struggling with energy costs since the Ukraine war, is now staring at a potential major energy supply crisis that European leaders are describing in emergency terms. A professor of international relations at the University of Copenhagen said Europe will be facing a major energy supply crisis if the Strait of Hormuz is not reopened, and yet there is no clear path to reopening it right now. Iran has a new supreme leader in Mujtaba Khamenei, who pledged to maintain the effective closure of the Strait of Hormuz. He has come to power in the most dramatic possible circumstances. His father assassinated, his family struck, the Islamic Republic under direct military assault, and his first act is to declare the strait closed and pledge to continue the fight. On March 5th, a military source told Iran's Fars news agency that Iran had fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles and almost 2,000 drones since February 28th. 500 missiles, 2,000 drones in 2 weeks, from a country that was supposed to have had its military infrastructure degraded by Israeli airstrikes in 2025. What does that tell you? It tells you that the rearming worked. It tells you that the Russian supplied systems, the Chinese components, the satellite intelligence, all of it functioned. Iran walked into this war with a rebuilt arsenal, and it has been using it relentlessly. The war in the Middle East is creating the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, with crude and oil product flows through the Strait of Hormuz plunging from around 20 million barrels per day before the war to a trickle currently. The IEA used that phrase, the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, larger than 1973, larger than the Iranian Revolution, larger than the Gulf War. History is not a word that economists and energy analysts use casually. When the International Energy Agency says you are witnessing the largest supply disruption in history, they mean it. And the American public is largely absorbing this as background noise, as another international crisis competing with domestic headlines, when in reality, the consequences of this crisis are going to land on American kitchen tables, American gas stations, American retirement accounts within weeks and months if it continues. Now, here is the deeper question, the one that almost never gets asked on cable news, the one that requires you to step back from the immediate drama of explosions and headlines and think structurally about what is happening to the architecture of world power. The United States made a military bet. It bet that overwhelming force applied suddenly could decapitate the Iranian regime, destroy its nuclear program, and create the conditions for a pro-Western successor government to emerge from the chaos. Israel had been pushing for this strike for years. Trump had the political will to authorize it. And the military execution, the killing of Khamenei, the strikes across 24 provinces, was precise. By conventional military measures, it was a success. But the question that never got answered before the first bomb dropped was this: what happens the day after? What happens when Iran fires back not just at Israel, but at every American base in the Gulf simultaneously? What happens when the Strait of Hormuz closes and stays closed? What happens when Russia shares American positions with Iranian Missile Command, and when Chinese satellite imagery guides Iranian drones to their targets? The strikes on Iranian infrastructure, particularly the port of Bandar Abbas, threatened to collapse the international north-south transport corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative, which Russia and China rely on to bypass Western-controlled maritime routes. So even China and Russia are taking economic damage from this war. Their own infrastructure investments inside Iran are being hit. Their own strategic corridors are being disrupted, and yet they have not stepped back. They have leaned in, because for Moscow and Beijing, the long-term strategic value of degrading American dominance in the Middle East outweighs the short-term economic cost of this war. They are absorbing the pain because they believe the outcome, a Middle East where American military credibility has been exhausted, where Gulf states have turned elsewhere for security, where the dollar's role in oil trading has been further weakened, is worth it. The conflict disrupted approximately 20% of global oil supplies transiting the Strait of Hormuz, causing prices on the Brent crude oil market to rise from around $70 to over $110 per barrel within days. Gasoline prices rose above $4 per gallon, the highest since late 2023, and ABC News reports that rising energy prices have complicated the inflation outlook. The consumer price index, which had been coming down, now faces a reversal driven entirely by an external shock that American economic planners did not price into their models. And yet here we are. This is the cost of treating geopolitical strategy as if it operates in isolation from economic reality. This is the cost of building policy on the assumption that American military power can bend the behavior of nations that have spent years specifically architecting their own systems to be resistant to American pressure. What this means for you watching now is that the price you pay at the gas pump for groceries and the stability of financial markets are directly linked to decisions in Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and Washington. The world is no longer centered on a single superpower. Iran is a crucial node in the Belt and Road Initiative, a geostrategic bridge between East and West. When that node is disrupted, when trade corridors are blocked and waterways carrying a fifth of the world's oil are threatened, the shock travels to your economy, your family, your daily life. Meanwhile, while Washington debated sanctions and analysts argued over timelines, the deeper architecture, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the China-Iran deal, the Russia-Iran treaty, satellite networks, drone supply chains was quietly being built, and the consequences of ignoring it are now unfolding in oil prices, drone strikes, closed shipping lanes, and a new Iranian leader backed by two great powers ready to carry the conflict forward.